In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at Mao Zedong's contribution to Marxist revolutionary theory. We're going to be looking at his essay on contradiction. So Mao lived from 1893 to 1976, and what I want to focus on with him and his writing is, of course, the theory of it. There is, of course, the practical application of his theory, which he does talk about ways, of course, that in his account of dialectics, the ways in which it applies to practical, concrete situations. And so, in this way, we're going to be looking at his account of the relation between theory and practice. And I think it is actually a really good, succinct, clear, but deep and powerful account of this relation between theory and practice. So we're going to be looking at how Maoism took part in the tradition of Marxism, Leninism, and then moved it on, kind of not necessarily reformed it, but perhaps transformed it or developed it further, actually might be a better way to speak of it. So we can look at then, or we can separate, what I want to do here in this video is a kind of political science approach to China, the Communist Party in China, and things like that, as compared to the theory that Mao Zedong is writing about. So I want to distinguish those two things because it is debatable, what kind of state China currently is. Is it really communist? I think someone like Richard Wolff is correct to call it a kind of mixed capitalist state. So it's not quite state capitalism. It's got some kind of like socialist dimensions to it, insofar as there's been a clear kind of distribution of land to be owned by single individuals. There's been a serious raise in the standard of living. All kind of some kind of socialist programs here involved in that. But of course, you still have the general dichotomy between the owner or the capitalist and the proletariat or the working class. So that's why it's, I don't want to judge Marxist or Mao Zedong's theory based on the current, Chinese state. So I want to make sure that in our minds we can keep that a bit separate, and then maybe actually we can take this theory to further critique the Chinese state, and to what extent it's been successful in its movement towards communism and what its failures might be. Okay. Now, again, what Mao is doing here in this essay is he's trying to convince his fellow party members here in the 1930s why they should be interested in dialectics. He's afraid that many of his fellow party comrades are becoming too influenced in a kind of vulgar materialism. And this essay is meant to be a defense of dialectics. So before we can get into Mao's defense of dialectics, we have to have a basic kind of grasp of Marxism. Now, this is definitely not a comprehensive account of Marxism. For the purposes of this essay, I wanted to focus on three main points that Marx wrote about. So again, this is not all, of course, of what Marx wrote about, but one of these is the primacy of practice. So this is actually my favorite quote from Marx. He says, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." So what does this mean? Well, he's saying it's not that some individuals, in their armchairs sit and they think about some idea, and then they implement that idea, and then they change how we live in society, right? As if they come up with a new theory of social organization or government or whatever else. But it's actually the opposite. It's that as kind of our material lives and social lives transform through certain material social practices and changes, those influence how we think about, how we rationalize our situation, and how we think about the possibilities of how we might live, of what our values are. So the focus then, and this is going to move us to revolutionary theory, the focus for philosophy should be on transforming our social being or our social relations, because that is what enables the transformation of our consciousness, of how we think about things, of what we think is possible, of what we think the ideals are that we should strive for. As he says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So the point of philosophy should be to change, right? To look at kind of, in a sense, power structures and not think about what are the moral concepts that we should all adopt and so try to influence and persuade one another of what the truth is, but instead the point of theory is to actually change how we live for the better. Now, Marx did this through his historical materialism and dialectical materialism. I'm going to leave dialectical materialism aside because we're actually going to look closely at that with Mao and his essay on contradiction. With historical materialism, right, what Marx talks about as the materialist method is this way of looking at the way that the social forces and material forces of production enable subsistence. And what Marx says is that the way in which human beings lived is always according to some kind of class dichotomy. That when we look back in history to the ancient era, it is marked by the dichotomy between the master and the slave. So if we look back at ancient Greece or ancient China, whatever, what we're going to find is some relation where the dominant relationship in terms of how, for example, food and things like that is produced, it's through a relation of a minority of masters and a majority who are slaves. Now, this does not mean that everyone was a slave. What it means, right, I mean, you could have some people that were what you might call like contractors, we would call them contractors now, or wage laborers who go around looking for work, or you could have craftsmen, artisans, etc., right? But they are not they are not part of that dominant framework that provides for the most basic aspect of life in that society. It is actually slave labor. And what's clear in this is that for the master has both material freedom and political freedom, and that the master's subsistence is guaranteed by the slave because the slave works and provides the master with food and resources to live. And also, of course, the master is politically free because they can choose to live wherever they want, etc. The slave, of course, lacks political freedom, but to some extent, actually, ironically, their material freedom is guaranteed to the extent that the master, as long as they want the slave, provides them with food. But by and large, they're still obviously unfree. Now, what happens is there's an erosion through the tensions of this master-slave dichotomy that moves to eventually the feudal era. Now, the feudal era is different, where you don't have a single master and then, owns individual slaves that respond specifically to that master. In the feudal era, instead of a slave, you have a serf, and the serf is tied to the land. So in this sense, the serf actually has a certain kind of material freedom in the sense that they're able to work their own plot of land and provide for themselves. So to some extent, their subsistence is guaranteed. But they lack political freedom because they can never leave that plot of land. They're bound to that land over which then the Lord oversees it. So whereas in the ancient epic, the slave knows that they are enslaved to the specific master, in the feudal era, the serf is actually enslaved to the land, not a specific lord, although lord has certain dominion over the serf. Now, eventually, as this breaks down its internal contradictions, produce a new epic that tries again to resolve a bit of the tensions between the serf and the lord. The next epic is capitalism. Now, in capitalism, again, just like the master, and just like the lord, the capitalist is politically free, but the capitalist is also materially or economically free in the sense that their subsistence is provided for by wage laborers or the working class or the proletariat, to use the French word, right? And so the owners of capital, or the bourgeoisie, to use the French term, they do not obviously own any individual worker. And in fact, the worker is not tied to any land. So the worker in this sense is politically free to go and work within limits whatever job they want. The problem is they're never materially or economically free. Their subsistence is never guaranteed, right? And this affects, to some extent, actually the things they can do politically or socially. We know this with healthcare, right? To the extent whether you have healthcare or not depends on what risks you can take in terms of what jobs you want to apply for and so on. The difference here, though, is the working class is not, right? A worker, a wage laborer, is not tied to or enslaved to any one person. They're not enslaved to the land. The difference for how the previous tensions were resolved is in capitalism, the worker is actually enslaved to a class, the capitalist class, because to continue living in society, they have to work for a capitalist, or they have to be a capitalist. Now, of course, the catch is that only a minority of people can actually be a capitalist, because a capitalist depends on workers. They depend on there being more workers than themselves, the owner of the capital resources. So you still have a situation where there's a certain amount of unfreedom, where there's this class antagonism between the owners and the workers in capitalism. Now, of course, we can see this trajectory through human history according to this historical materialist analysis, right? Where eventually the contradictions get resolved from the ancient to the feudal. Again, it gets resolved from the feudal to from the feudal era to capitalism. And what we find is in each case, the subordinate class gains a little bit more freedom. So, of course, the idea is, well, eventually that subordinate class would gain complete freedom and be equal with the dominant class. Communism is meant to be that next stage in history. It would be the end of history once communism is reached, in the sense that there's no more progression. The dialectic the tensions have been entirely resolved, and now there is no longer a owner class or the capitalist class and a working class. They're all just human beings that are completely equal in their freedom. They are all equally free politically and materially or economically. Right? So that's the ideal, and it's not just some ideal that was thought of in Marx's head, but it was the result of looking at having a material analysis of society itself. Right? It's a reflection of the trends of society. Now, again, we're looking at 1930s China, and in the Communist Party in China here, there's this movement to interpret Marxism in a certain way through what's known as vulgar materialism. And it's this kind of approach that just says, well, it's just how you achieve communism is through just some kind of approach to focusing on resources, what people have, right? So improving the ability to produce goods and things like that, and that's it. And we're going to see Mao's actually going to say it's a little more complicated. So let's begin looking at that. So Mao says that there are two conceptions of development. There's the metaphysical conception of development and the dialectical conception of development. Now, the metaphysical conception of development is basically that idea that there are substances in the world where they have a certain essence to them. That essence is unchanging in the sense that if you have like a glass, then what a glass is always going to be what a glass is. It can never be anything else. And how it comes to be is the proportion to which it achieves itself being a glass or a cup, or it decreases. It might degrade over time. And so there can be this repetition between an increase in its being and a decrease in its being. As he says, the metaphysical or vulgar evolutionist outlook sees things as isolated, static, and one-sided. It regards all things in the universe, their forms and their species, as eternally isolated from one another and immutable. Such change as there is can only be an increase or decrease in quantity or a change of place. And metaphysicians hold that all the different kinds of things in the universe and all their characteristics have been the same ever since they first came into being. So what he's saying is you have this sense that, right, the essence of a glass is entirely different from the essence of a phone, and to be a phone doesn't depend at all on what a glass or a cup is. They're completely different, so their being is static. It's unchanging. Now, of course, again, we're going to see this applied to the social and political realm of life. So he says, in their opinion, capitalist exploitation, capitalist competition, the individualist ideology of capitalist society, and so on, can all be found in ancient slave society or even in primitive society, and will exist forever unchanged. So we can get this sense of sometimes what's referred to in Marxism as kind of like the economists or the apologists for capitalism would basically say, well, this kind of exploitation that exists in capitalism is just a kind of mark of human nature, unchanging. And what Mao wants to say is it's, well, one, ahistorical. It has no account of history, actually, and change throughout time. But it's also not a very nuanced account. It's actually a very naive account of the essence of things. I think it's important, actually, to briefly say something about what exactly he means by capitalist exploitation, competition, and so on. The Marxist account of exploitation is simply that a worker, let's say, produces goods that sell for $100. They get paid $10 an hour. It took them an hour to produce that $100. And let's say the capitalist supplied machines that the workers used to produce the goods. And it only, let's say, just for sake of making this the math easy for myself, the machines the capitalists provided only cost, let's say, $10. So what happened was the worker produces $100 worth of goods. It cost $10 to have the materials and the capital resources to produce the goods. So the surplus value, or what's called the profit, is going to be $90, right? Because you take the $10 worth of resources that the capitalist provided. The worker produced $100 worth of goods in 1 hour. $90 is left over. So that's the surplus value, or the profit. Now, the worker has been told that they will get paid $10 an hour for their work. So let's say they get $10. Well, you then have $80 that is left over, actually, of surplus value. Now, what happens with that surplus value, that money, that $80, that's all determined by the capitalist, by the owner. Because the owner gets to say, well, I'm going to keep the rest of it for myself. Or the owner is going to say, maybe I'll give you an extra $10, maybe not, right? The point is the kind of ability to determine what one produces, what's done with the profits from, what one has produced, all of that is alienated from the worker. In that way, then, the worker is exploited because they produce a greater amount of value than what they then receive actually back in return. Now, when he talks about capitalist competition, he's just talking about the kind of race to the bottom that occurs where two different, let's say, businesses have to compete with one another for consumers. So one business lowers their price. They succeed for a short amount of time in making more money. The other business eventually then has to lower the price of their goods. They do this by an advance in technologies where they can produce things maybe quicker with some technology, or they figure out how to have, maybe they get rid of one worker and have the rest of the workers do more work, etc. Usually it has to do with labor or technology in this sense. So the other company is able to lower their price, and then the other company eventually is going to want to lower their price again to compete. So you basically have this race to the bottom. So that's the mark of capitalist competition. And then what he means by the individualist ideology of capitalist society is that, of course, what capitalism wants to do is make persons in capitalism thought of to be as kind of like atomic individuals, where they're actually not related at all, that what they think is completely their own. It's separate from anyone else, so they don't have to have concern for anyone else, and they start to moralize. And when they find themselves to be working a 40-hour week and yet still poor, what will happen is they'll say, well, this must be my fault. I'm not working hard enough, right? As opposed to looking at the systemic, the basic structure of society that makes it such that that person can work 40 hours a week and yet still be relatively poor. Okay, so his point is all these kinds of concepts, what the Communist Party was doing in the 1930s is they were starting to interpret these things in a kind of metaphysical way. Now, what Mao says is this needs to be interpreted in a dialectical way. The dialectic has to do with a unity of opposites. So it's the division of a unity into mutually exclusive opposites and the reciprocal relation. So to explain this, he says, in order to understand the development of a thing, we should study it internally and in its relations with other things. In other words, the development of things should be seen as their internal and necessary self-movement, while each thing in its movement is interrelated to and interacts on the things around it. Changes in society are due chiefly to the development of the internal contradictions in society. That is, the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production, the contradiction between classes, and the contradiction between the old and the new. It is the development of these contradictions that pushes society forward and gives the impetus for the supersession of the old society by the new. So this whole essay is basically going to be in defense of dialectics here as opposed to the metaphysical account of the natures of things. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So he says that there are two ways to understand contradiction, universally and in its particularity. So he says contradictions exist universally in two ways. First, in the process of the development of all things. So it's just that all things only come into being by its opposite, right? That just think of the fact that the way that you exist is to consume things that have to be dead. When you die, you make possible new things to become alive, to live, right? That's just one example, but you can find this basically in everything, this general tendency or this trend for there to be the opposite included in all things, which is what makes it possible. Right? This is a little bit similar to what is argued in the Tao Te Ching, for example. The difference here, though, is this is more of a Hegelian account of the dialectic in a sense of progress towards some ultimate end, right, is the purpose for the movement of all things, that if there's supposed to be this kind of eventual resolving of the tensions or the contradictions in things. Now, the second way that contradictions exist universally is in the process of development of each thing, a movement of opposites exists from beginning to end. So we have the general account of universality, but also this general in the particular. So he says, in war, offense and defense, advance and retreat, victory and defeat are all mutually contradictory phenomena. One cannot exist without the other. The two aspects are at once in conflict and interdependence, and this constitutes the totality of a war, pushes its development forward, and solves its problems. So we can know the universal only actually by looking at particulars, so we actually have to extrapolate from the particulars to get this general account of universal contradiction. So again, right, we even have in the explanation of the dialectic the universal and the particular. Opposites, yet each can only be known on the basis of its other. So then contradictions exist particularly. The particular essence of each form of motion is determined by its own particular contradictions. So the way that contradictions are related to one another, the two opposites, is particular, right? It's not the case that you have this same form of contradictions in all things. You have a contradiction in all things, but each contradiction plays out, is marked, is understood, is realized in its own particular way. So he says, for example, positive and negative numbers in mathematics, actions and reactions in mechanics, positive and negative electricity in physics, dissociations and combinations in chemistry, forces of production and relations of production, classes and class struggle in social science, offense and defense in military science, idealism and materialism, the metaphysical outlook and the dialectical outlook in philosophy. So in all these different disciplines, the way they investigate the world is in a particular kind of contradiction or a particular kind of dialectic that is unique. And the problem, of course, would be if you wanted to interpret the entire world according to the dialectic of the positive and the negative numbers, as in mathematics. As if you had mathematics try to explain the entire world. Or as if you had, for example, let's say, in military science, offense and defense, try to explain the whole world. It explains one phenomena of the whole world, but not the whole world itself. That requires special attention being paid to the particularity of contradictions as they exist in their own right. Now, the dialectic as a theory is practical insofar as the dialectic actually shows us, it is actually normative in a sense. It's not only descriptive, but it's actually normative because it shows us what contradictions are and how then they should be resolved. Or at least, at the very least, that they should be resolved. So the principle dialectic shows us that different methods must be used to resolve different contradictions. Mao says there are many contradictions in the course of the development of any major thing. For instance, in the course of China's bourgeois democratic revolution, where the conditions are exceedingly complex, there exists the contradiction between all the oppressed classes in Chinese society and imperialism, the contradiction between the great masses of the people and feudalism, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the contradiction between the peasantry and the urban petty bourgeoisie. So this would be kind of the peasantry, and the urban petty bourgeoisie would kind of be like a small business owner. There's this contradiction because in a way they're both materially or economically free insofar as their subsistence is guaranteed, but it's through a completely different process where, of course, the peasant labors themselves and the small business owner does not. They have other people that they employ that do the laboring. Okay. And he says, so you have as well this contradiction between, so then the small business owner and the bourgeoisie on the other hand. The contradiction between the various reactionary ruling groups, and so on. These contradictions cannot be treated in the same way since each has its own particularity. So a social theory, a political theory that wants to advance freedom, that wants to resolve these contradictions in order to free people from this relationship of domination, it would be wrong, like the vulgar materialists or the metaphysicians want to do, if they want to say, well, there's just one way to approach all these problems. What Mao is saying is you have to look at each particular contradiction and resolve it on its own terms. So he says the two aspects of each contradictions cannot be treated in the same way since each aspect has its own characteristics. Now, these own characteristics then are going to be what's called the secondary contradictions. So you have the principal contradiction in capitalism, which is that between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat, whose means of subsistence is given by working for the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie whose means of subsistence is given by the proletariat selling their labor time to the bourgeoisie. But within that principal contradiction, right, you have all these different kinds of contradictions that manifest themselves. These are called secondary contradictions. So the remnant feudal class and the bourgeoisie, between the peasant petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists. So that, again, that would be between like a corporation and a small business owner, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, etc. All these kinds of contradictions have to be dealt with on their own terms. And we'll see this later on in the same way that you have these contradictions between, yes, the working class and the capital class, which is the principal contradiction. But you also have these secondary contradictions, like, for example, the patriarchy or racial kind of hierarchy. These are secondary contradictions that are manifesting in a particular way due to the fact that they exist in a particular or historical time. But it would be wrong, for example, to try to tackle the patriarchy or to try to tackle racism solely through some kind of like a materialist lens without also treating that contradiction, which is not separate, though. This is the point. So the struggles of the patriarchy, of feminism, the struggles of minority groups trying to fight against racism, what Mao is saying is these are not separate struggles. Now, they have their own particular identities, but those struggles only make sense also in relation to the principal struggle, which is that between the working class and the capital class. Right? In this way, he's showing how you can actually link together all these social movements, these social phenomena, where they actually don't have to be distinct. And this is the power of the dialectic, is it says, look, at the same time, one and the same time, we can have a universal movement which says we want to free everyone from domination, and yet we also have to pay particular attention to each struggle, each contradiction in its own right, and tackle it to some extent on its own terms in relation to the larger project. Now, the mechanical materialist or the vulgar materialist or the metaphysician, right? They're basically going to say there are principal contradictions only. There's only the contradiction between the working class and the capital class. So for them, practice is the principal aspect in the contradiction between theory and practice. In the contradiction between the economic base and the superstructure, the economic base is the principal aspect, and so on. So just real quick, the economic base is just basically the forces of production, so factories and things like that produce goods. And the superstructure is kind of like the legal framework, the political framework, so the kind of government you have, etc., that is influenced by the economic base. So this is what the mechanical materialist wants to say, is that, well, what kind of government you have, what kind of legal structure you have, it's all determined by the economic base. But what Mao wants to say is, you're misunderstanding the dialectic. Yes, we are materialists. We say that there's a certain preference or deference given to the material. But you are not dialectical if you also don't admit that sometimes the non-principal contradictions, sometimes the superstructure influences the economic base. Sometimes ideas can influence practice. So a dialectical materialist incorporates both principal and non-principal contradictions into its revolutionary theory. As Mao says, it must also be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and the superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. When it is impossible for the productive forces to develop without a change in the reactions of production, when the change in the relations of production plays the principal and decisive role. While we recognize that in the general development of history, the material determines the mental and social being determines social consciousness, we must also recognize the reaction of the mental on material things, of social consciousness on social being, and of the superstructure on the economic base. So this is what he's saying, is we have to recognize, for example, after the 60s, right? This movement to start putting emphasis not merely on the working class, not merely on laborers, as kind of unionized blue-collar workers, as men and things like that, but also to recognize, look, there are these new ideas about feminism, about trans rights, gay rights, etc., that are developing. And these actually can be revolutionary. These ideas can influence then the economic base. We can look at these struggles and say, you know what? How can we transform the economic base to better address the issues that the gay rights movement, for example, is dealing with? Because sometimes it can't just be the case that how you change the social relations in a factory is going to solve all the problems of homophobia, for example, right? That's just not going to happen. So again, there has to be this dialectical approach. That's what Mao is saying has to be the case for the communist movement. So what he's been writing here, what we've been looking at, is revolutionary theory. It's not just a description of how the world works, of how society works, of how theory works. It's also normative. It is saying, because of how society works, this is how we ought to approach these problems. So there's an antagonism that exists between classes, right? And it manifests itself in a particular way in the struggle of opposites. Now, what we see historically is that the bourgeoisie were once the progressive class in the face of, the reactionary class of the feudal lords, right? Back before capitalism arose in the 17th century, you had a movement where the lords tried to prevent merchants from gaining power. So the lords were reactionary. The merchants were progressive because they're saying, hey, look, now there's this possibility where I can make money and I don't have to have been born by, a noble lord or something like that, right? There's a kind of freedom in that. But of course, ultimately, it manifests itself on the basis of a contradiction, where then to make that kind of a living, eventually you have to become a business owner, where you have to employ people, where then you have an entire class where the majority of society now, to get their means of subsistence, have to sell their labor time to the capitalist class. In that way, then the proletariat, the working class, becomes the progressive class, and the former merchants and now the capitalist class becomes the reactionary class. So what is this theory then that, for example, has this account of this historical materialist account of society? What's this theory meant to do? Enable social revolution to end oppression in all its forms. As Mao says, it is highly important to grasp this fact. It enables us to understand that revolutions and revolutionary wars are inevitable in class society, and that without them, it is impossible to accomplish any leap in social development and to overthrow the reactionary ruling classes, and therefore impossible for the people to win political power. Communists must expose the deceitful propaganda of the reactionaries, such as the assertion that social revolution is unnecessary and impossible. And what Mao is saying is, in fact, what history tells us, what this kind of dialectical analysis tells us, is not only is social revolutionary possible to have freedom for the masses, to have true democratic power for the masses, but it is inevitable. Because the proletariat, because the working class, because the masses are the subordinate class, history tells us that power is in their hands to overthrow the oppressors, to win the world for themselves. Now, I wanted to briefly look at this account that the philosopher Mufawad Paul in his book Continuity and Rupture makes for Mao's kind of place in Marxist theory. And basically what Mufawad Paul says is that Maoism kind of represents a certain rupture with actually the Marxist-Leninist tradition, insofar as Mao wants to say, look, there's a particular problem that Marxism-Leninism ran into, right? It kind of came to a dead end. And there had to be a new way, right? So this is the way in which theory and ideas can be important dialectically. There had to be a new way to analyze society. And this is where, though, we have this continuity, because in this new way to analyze society, it reinterprets the basic Marxist concepts of, for example, proletariat. So Mufawad Paul thinks, for example, this big issue that the communist movement was dealing with in the 20th century was the question of how does the communist movement relate to the struggles of minorities, that regarding race, gender, sexuality, and other identity-based concerns. He says, hence, emergent anti-systemic struggles were often excluded from even the anti-revisionist movement, a place where they could have flourished due to aspects of Marxist-Leninist rigidity that had not as a whole been dissolved by the Maoist rupture. Marxism was treated as questionable by those who were involved in these identity-based struggles. Why would the nascent queer revolutionary join a movement that rejected their very existence? So there was actually a problem with a certain kind of homophobia in the communist movement, for example, in the middle of the 20th century. But what Mufawad Paul wants to say is Maoism, because of its account of the dialectic, says no, actually, there is a place for the feminist movement, for the gay rights movement, etc., in the communist movement. So, again, we can see this where the universal is contained in the particular. That what Maoism does is expands the concept of the proletariat to the masses. Mufawad Paul says, once we start examining the proletariat in a mass sense, so not merely as someone who has to fit the rigid definition of the working class, but now in this much grander scope to be the dominated in what particular ever form it manifests itself in, which, he says, is what Maoists believe is germinal, this mass sense, to Marx's thought, then we are forced to wonder at the composition of the working class in a given particular context. There is a working class at the centers at capitalism that is unionized and possesses certain benefits due to this unionization. At the same time, though, there are non-unionized laborers and an unemployed reserve army. Right, so basically unemployed people, or people, right, could be stay-at-home moms, etc., right, that wouldn't seem to fit the working class. And yet, because Maoism expands the concept of proletariat to the masses, now we can say even the stay-at-home mom is dominated through some kind of contradiction, right, where they are, maybe society is saying this is what you ought to do, and they're restricted in their free development of themselves as a human being. So he says, these same people are part of the revolutionary masses precisely because they greatly outnumber that fraction of the working class that was once treated, according to tired formula, as the proletariat. So the revolutionary potential in Maoism, then, we can see in the Marxist tradition, is the way in which it expands the concept of proletariat to include other struggles that don't seem to be immediately related to materialist concerns.